again. Welcome. Uh, Margaret uh, was married to Pulitzer. She also had written a biography of McKinley, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, along with the book that I'm going to be talking about today. Uh, she, her since it was her father-in-law, you can look at it kind of sideways, but truly, this book, which is Reveille in Washington, 1860 to 1865, a story of our city, of the city. Um, it deserves. It deserves the prize. So, I begin with, of course, the Reveille is a signal given by a bugle, a drum, to awaken soldiers or sailors in the morning, or the hour at which this takes place. Basically, on page 30 of the book, we're introduced to this with, again, of course, these are the war years, the Civil War years, and on a dark early morning, drum taps in E Street frightened good citizens from their beds. Hoisting windows and thrusting their night-capped heads into the fog, they discovered that the uproar was not a revolution, but reveille. They would certainly get accustomed, unfortunately, to that sound in their city. This particular book is a Washington novel, and basically, it's a popular history. She was a novelist first, and then began her writings in history, and so, the book reads easily, as if you were reading a novel. Unfortunately, it's all true. Basically, though, what most Reveille in Washington portrays the city of Washington more vividly, accurately, and thoroughly than any other book, period. Its portrait of Washington transcends the time, and we'll see that. Our protagonist, then, of this story is city of Washington. And in Washington, as in 1800, 1850, and 1860, wrote Henry Adams, the same rude colony was camped in the same forest with the same unfinished Greek temples for workrooms and mud paths for roads. European travelers looked at each other askance and wondered why this was our capital at all. Sorry. By travelers from overseas, for example, the mansion, the executive mansion, itself was dismissed as an ordinary country house, wanting in either taste or splendor, but it was an ordinary country home. The Americans, of course, who roved through were amazed. We were proud of this mansion, and basically, though, it's mentioned first here in the very early parts of the book. It's a southern kind of country home, and that comes into play throughout the wars. So basically, we describe what our city then, it's in, maybe not infancy, it's a toddler in 1860, and these were the sites of federal metropolis: 6 scattered buildings, a few dubious statues, and 1/3 of an obelisk. And barring an inspection of the government greenhouses or a drive in the Navy Yard, the arsenal, or the observatory, there was nothing more to be seen within the city limits. This is a paragraph that I love, and it's just shows her writing. It was a mere ambitious beginner, a baby among capitals. Its defects were those of youth and energy and inexperience. Yet people were ready to fancy it moldering and abandoned, a relic of an optimistic moment, of the time when men had essayed an experiment called democracy. Dissolution was heavy in the air, and even the rising monuments of the Republic wore the image of ruin and decay. So we find our toddler having trouble to walk in 1860. The book goes on to describe poor Buchanan's little presidency. And basically, we find that he is completely startled by the newcomers, because as Lincoln is president-elect, these Westerners start arriving in our city of Washington. This toddler with more southern roots than northern. Mr. Buchanan, the president, stood before the newcomers like a decadent patrician facing the hordes of the Vandals. No one knew quite what to do with the people that were coming. Unfortunately, poor Buchanan's last levee in the capital is pretty reminiscent of his entire what do I want to say? Not reign, but you know what I mean. At this last levee, the band began with Dixie, and it ended with Yankee Doodle. It was the epitome of Mr. Buchanan's administration. Change does arrive, and we find Mr. Lincoln coming in. Mr. Lincoln, even at this time, excuse me, is already aware, of course, like most people should have been, of what's going on. And in his inaugural speech, unlike the feelings of most Washingtonians, his voice rings out, "We are not enemies, but friends." Unfortunately, it didn't work out that well. Soldiers begin to arrive, and we find that we have an army of wounded men eventually occupying the city. What has happened during a very short period of time is, in our city, the brash confidence had gone with the bright militia uniforms. There were no more military spectacles and concerts, which were held on the lawn of the White House. Regimental bands had been abolished. It was just, it had to be startling. I can't even imagine what it was like. We get into a chapter that is called The Army of the Wounded, and we find that it's just, she explains it so well, the wounded arriving, and let's see, I'm sorry. At the same time, we're introduced to many people that would go on to become famous. Carnegie is referred to then as Andy Carnegie. He's a very young man. He helps to organize transportation of the troops. We're introduced to Pinkerton. We meet a wonderful woman, although not so wonderful in many people's eyes, but her name is Belle Boyd, and there certainly should be a book written about her. She had been on a ship in 1863 out of North Carolina, hoping to ride out the rest of the war in London. It was captured, but the captain of the ship that captured her and subsequently had her imprisoned was the person who pleaded for her release. She then goes on with him into London. She marries a Hardnage, and two other men afterwards. In the meantime, when she was running low on funds, Belle was gay and pretty, and she was on the stage. And really, she continued this until her later years. Apparently, she enjoyed it. Her husbands must have been really kind of unusual men for their time, and if nothing else, I think their mothers were probably aghast when they brought dear old Belle home. In the same time, of course, with our wounded men, we meet a Louisa May Alcott, who it dawned on Louisa, that she was expected to wash these soldiers. She's a new nurse. This is her new adventure, actually, for her. She was flabbergasted, but she could take a joke on herself. I drowned my scruples in my washball, she wrote, clutched my soap manfully, and assuming a businesslike air, made a dab at the first dirty specimen I saw. He was an old and Irish, and soon they were both laughing. Louisa scrubbed with a good will after that, faces and necks and ears, breasts and shoulders and feet. The male attendants, of course, remember the time, finished off the rest. We also meet a young Walt Whitman, who is pretty much penniless, and though he has scribbled Leaves of Grass, he he's not getting a lot of money for it, but he was a kind man, and he went to the hospital, saw this suffering, and he wrote back to his family and friends and newspapers the fact that he was going to the hospital. His pockets would be loaded with, he carried a good-sized jar of jelly and spooned it out to the occupants of the ward. He did not encourage the use of tobacco, but he had a store of cut plugs for those who craved it in his pocket to dole out. He often left money in bright new 10-cent and 5-cent bills. Sick men longed for the fresh milk that was carried for sale through the wards, and Walt thought it raised their spirits to have a little cash by them. Unfortunately, at the same time, our city is a toddler that is not having exactly a happy youth. And 2 bitter years had made them callous to the loss of thousands of men, and above the sighs and the weeping arose a shrill new noise of laughter. People were beginning to spend money and to give parties, to dine and dance and be merry. We go on to find a new season in Washington. Washington is a young adult, maybe an adolescent at this point. And just like the 1920s, familiar to Miss Leech, they kind of had enough. They began to dine and to dance and to laugh. And but she writes so well, and in one example she writes, Everywhere ladies in fall costumes of redundant skirts and sugarloaf beaver hats gleam with scarlet like the maples. Somehow in just that one sentence you can imagine this city that has just decided we're gonna make the most of what's happening. We meet Mr. McLennan at the time, and I will go in to say that he really thought that he could become a dictator, and writes home to his wife to say just as much. There's not a flattering portrait of the man, and I think we all know he really didn't accomplish much as the head of the Army of the Potomac. We meet all the generals in a chapter called Lost Leaders. I'm skipping around. But we also see a city that has money problems. It scars casualty lists like people did in every city in the North and the South. Lincoln announces the first draft. And soldiers arrive again, but it's not the same. For you. They begin arriving, mostly unfortunately, in boats carrying victims. The Grant had advanced in the South, and his base had been removed. Those people that were around that base who were wounded needed somewhere to go because the hospital was closing. They were abandoning the city, and crowds gathered at the 6th Street Wharf to meet the steamers. Even the gangways were lined with people. Women wept aloud as the leaders passed. 2 by 2, bearers went through the streets, carrying men too far gone to be placed in the ambulances. The death rate in the hospitals began a fearful ascent. In those few words, again, she tells us so much about, unfortunately, our war. Of course, at this point, of course, Mr. Lincoln is introducing himself to the city, and to go back a bit, he does a few things that we're all familiar with now, but I'm sorry to be fumbling around, please excuse me. But he of course, let me just go back, is announcing what we know is his first sort of, it's not the Emancipation Proclamation, but he originally is trying just to get people to understand, I believe. And in September, after Antietam, he issued his preliminary proclamation on the first day of January in 1863. The slaves of persons in rebellion against the government were proclaimed to be free. When that doesn't exactly work and we really need something strong, we find out that Mr. Lincoln does then announce, and there is a signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. On that particular day, which was January 1st, which was the beginning of the season, an open house in the White House, he had shaken I don't know how many hands. Threading his way through the mob of the New Year's callers about the White House came the slender, amiable man whom the radicals hated, with his slender, amiable son by his side. William Frederick Seward climbed the stairs to the president's office. There were less than a dozen persons in the room. This sounds amazing, but in the room to witness the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Conscious of a moment in history, the president closed his aching fingers on a pen. His whole right arm was numb from the ordeal of the morning's receptions. He feared his hand might tremble, but he signed his name firmly. The slaves at this point on Mr. Lincoln, the Lincoln who lives in the American legend was shaped in the slave's long dream of a kindly master who would set his people free. In our winter, in that winter, when we're dining and dancing, and Washington has become a little bit tired of everything, we find out that there's in the London papers, Europe still looks down on the capital, of course. London gives a really, really poor report on our adolescent city at this point. And to foreign visitors, Washington still appeared an outlandish place. Mr. George Augustus Sala looked it over that winter as a correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph. His rhetoric, of course, was contemptuous, and he called our adolescent capital a vast practical joke, a great, scrambling, slack-baked embryo of a city basking in the December sun like an alligator on the mud banks of a bayou in July. Oh, stop. Finish up or stop? Okay. I'm just going to skip forward.
No, you don't need to skip forward.
What?
You're going to go back up.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
She had the Margaret Leech Pulitzer had the privilege of attending Vassar, and her point of attending Vassar was to get a degree in journalism. And here she is writing some of the best pieces of history. So I'm going to go on and talk, and why I'm bringing these particular people up at the same time is because what Margaret Leech is she comes from a long line of abolitionists and feminists. And her two very close friends, one of them being Ruth Hale Braun, who was the founder of the Lucy Stone League, who was really the first feminist organization in the Americas. That includes Canada. And what Ruth Hale Braun brought to the organization was she was not, unlike Margaret Leech, who was very beautiful and well-versed. Ruth Hale was very unattractive and well-versed. And she held feminism first, and rights of the black population second, and journalism third. You know, and there were lots of quotes back then that talked about, you know, God, man, and country. Well, for her, it was feminism, black rights, and journalism. And what she also brought to the feminist movement, and this again is the second period in American feminism. The first period of American feminism was the Susan B. Anthonys and what was then called the League of Women. And these women were essentially asking for the vote. Well, what Ruth Hale was looking for was a little bit step beyond that, which was acceptance, the ability to hold a job, equal rights for equal pay. Amazing that they're talking about this just after 1919. And you have to understand, and why I bring this up is because these are the foremothers of today's feminism. What Ruth Hale also brought is she brought her family's fortune into the mix and was able to establish this league which hosted women going around the country to libraries and athenaeums talking about, and colleges, talking about the rights of women, the rights of workers, very motivational. Anyways, she ended up meeting Haywood Braun during her time at the table. And he was a journalist and a playwright, and he wrote a number of scripts for a number of what would become movies later on. Anyways, so Dorothy Parker was not the only woman in this vicious circle, and Ruth Hale Braun and Margaret Leech Pulitzer held their own in this crowd. And it's too bad that we don't really talk about them, and that's the reason why we brought this second phase about the Algonquin Roundtable. So my next topic is going to be John O'Hara. Now, John O'Hara was young when this was going on. He was in his 20s. He had just left Pennsylvania. His father was a very early neurosurgeon, and an inventor. Anyways, his father died young when he was younger, and just before he was going to enter college, and he had all plans on going to Princeton or Yale, and it never panned out. Now, just to let you know that his two younger brothers ended up graduating from Yale, and then the other from Princeton. And that draws their family into, and he never ends up talking to his brothers again, because he was so hurt that he was unable to attend. He was not financed. So what was very interesting about him, in 1924, He moves to New York City. He writes as a freelance writer. And between 1924 and 1934, which is about when